Welcome to the NC DWI Guy podcast, where defenders of the Constitution assemble to prepare for courtroom battle and firm owners gather to develop marketing strategies that will revolutionize the practice of criminal defense. Here's your host, the NC DWI Guy, Jake Minnick.
Hello, fellow freedom fighters, and welcome to another episode of the NC DWI Guy podcast. Today, we have a very special guest on the program, Meghann Burke. She is the president of the local Buncombe County Bar Association and has been an amazing leader for us here in the local bar of Buncombe County. So she is going to share her wisdom in terms of how the local bar, can support individual attorneys and how individual attorneys can support one another, offer us some kind of tips for making sure that we are going to bat for one another in and out of the courtroom. Meghann, it is a pleasure to have you on. Thanks very much for joining us.
Jake, it's a pleasure. Thank you for the kind introduction and for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so tell me, I guess, what was the kind of thrusting of you into this like leadership role in Buncombe County? Kind of describe what that looked like. Was I would assume that with most of these kind of like organizational things, you most of the time get like picked on to do this kind of work. So how did that shape up?
It's a version of that story. You know, the truth of the matter is, so the honest answer and how I came to work for the law firm with Bill Brazil is that I moved back to Asheville to study for the winter bar exam after I'd played soccer professionally, and came home to take the winter bar and start practicing law. And, my wife and I knew we want to build our lives here in Asheville, and she was launching the campaign for Southern Equality. And I didn't have a job. So I had to for the winter bar you pass. And at that time there was no formal swearing in process. Yeah. So I literally was like, I think I know a lawyer. Holly Fairbairn was like, call Cindy Crawford. I was like, the model? She's like, no, the judicial assistant.
I love that. Every time that I call her office, that's what I think of. I can't help but make that association.
When you're new to town, you're like, is this real? There's no system, there's no whatever. Now it's different. And Cindy couldn't have been nicer. She's like, Judge Barrett would be happy to swear you in. So they squeezed me in, before something like 9 o'clock, whatever. And Judge Barrett said, as I'm getting sworn in, you have a job. And of course, that's a great introduction to a job, just to say, no, I don't have a job I'm looking at. And she goes, well, you should call Bill Brazil. If he's not hiring an associate, he should be. And
that's
I
awesome.
said, okay. I'm going to use that if that's okay.
Yeah.
Max Cogburn had just been sworn in as a federal judge. And so Bill basically had the work 1.5 lawyers, as he put it, but not quite, 2, because Max had been winding down, anticipating again on the bench. So Bill and I just totally hit it off. Fortunate from the very beginning that we just really were jiving with each other. Went out to lunch at the old Trips where the Hilton Garden is.
I just thought of that place the other day. I was running down that part of the sidewalk, and I was like, Trips used to be here. That's funny.
That's right. Rest in peace, Trips. That's the only time in my life I've ever been to Trips. He picked the lunch spot, and to this day I still give him a hard time that with all the amazing restaurants that we have in Asheville, we went to Trips. Kicked off our partnership. We just hit it off and had a great time. And so I took on the district court. He'd been, for many, many years, Bill was one of the few lawyers who had hired a Spanish-speaking paralegal to better serve our Spanish-speaking community. Because he, as someone with a lot of experience, he's been practicing 30 years, he'd go to the courthouse to handle traffic tickets, and he'd see these Spanish-speaking folks trying to find their way around the courthouse, and everything's in English, and didn't understand what was going on in the courtroom, and they're entering pleas without, it's just really concerning to someone who's deeply concerned about due process and constitutional rights. And so Bill was one of the first to kind of really take that issue seriously. This is, 2002, 2004, that time frame.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I mean, we've done a lot of work with this Hispanic community. I did not realize that was a big part of Bill's practice for that long a period of time. So.
Yeah. And it was really, for him, it became a passion, and it wasn't necessarily, as Bill's done a lot of civil insurance defense, plaintiff's civil work in his lifetime, and is now a mediator, but it just irked him. He just was really the basic due process concerns and constituents were what he was concerned about. And so I dove into that practice, to district court traffic practice. As you know, well, it's funny when you dive into that line of work, a lot of it is low practice driven. It's like, so I'd be trying to find my way around, but where do I go do this? Then you go talk to Sally. She's the third door on the right on the fourth floor. And then if she's not there, go ask Judy across the hall. And then, but that's not the form you use here. You need the pink form. And then you need the green slip and the blue sheet. And at some point, I was just like I consider myself to be a fairly smart, well-educated person. And I am fumbling around where is this all written down? Like, what is this? And what I came to understand was that I truly believe that to the extent that I'm a good lawyer and do a good job for my clients, it is because of that coffee room that we sit in, and Andy Banzoff and Ted Beeson and you and, James Mills and Leanne and, Carrie, all these great lawyers would just sit around and talk about their cases. And I started to really I just soaked that up. VJ, was just the master in this traffic stuff. And I just came to learn so much just from absorbing their infinite wisdom and knowledge. And as a younger lawyer, I was sitting there going, there needs to be a way to systematize this. This is invaluable. And so I honestly, I was sort of thinking we need a Facebook for the courthouse, which clerks are which and who are, so I created the listserv. It was the easiest thing I think I've ever done, with the biggest return on investment I could possibly ask for.
What year was that? Do you remember around?
I could tell you that I was pregnant with our oldest team.
Okay.
2014 that I created a free listserv. It's just a subscriber Google-based platform, and literally it was we're sitting in the coffee room. These are conversations that are happening, and I'm thinking, wouldn't it be cool? NCAJ has a serve. What if we could local level just for this group about specific, issues that are specific to Buncombe County.
Right.
And people jump on it. I mean, the credit goes to our colleagues because everyone's like, that's a cool idea. Let's do it. And I'd say within a matter of weeks, we had 100 people on the list.
Yeah, that is so cool.
And it's honestly not a big, it's, and the funny thing is, I really mean this. I mean, at some point, someone's going to, I welcome all challengers to the role I'm in. I think we joked before the call that VJ a couple years ago gave me the title president, but it's really sucker in chief. I will happily take a contender election. No questions asked. But it's truly it's not a big lift. Someone new comes to town, they're fumbling around the courthouse like I was, and someone says to them now, hey, here's Megan's email address. Shoot her an email. She'll add you to the listserv. And I've gotten dozens and dozens of those emails since 2013, 14. Somebody moves to town, we pop them on. Someone becomes a DA, we take them off. I mean, it's very easy. It's just not hard. And, Henderson County, I think, has tried to replicate it because I just told them, I said, look, it's just not, it's an invaluable resource. Yeah. It's super easy. You just need one person who's willing to do it. And so that was me. At some point, I think there should be a term limit to my service, but
that's fine. So that's it's pretty cool to think about that. And, I guess it's neat to think that kind of spawned from that, break room in the courthouse. There's been many times over the past few months that I walk by that break room and it's empty, and it's kind of you feel the sadness and the longing for the camaraderie, but you also feel really bad for new attorneys that are trying to figure their way through the courthouse right now, because everything is kind of a different system, different process. You don't really have as much of an opportunity to get to know people. Because what I think is cool about the break room setting is that you can kind of walk in there and just kind of soak it in, or you can be actively engaged in the conversation. You don't have to be participating. You can just kind of sit there and listen to everything that is going on. And I feel like building the relationships in there, as you're talking about your family, sports, politics, whatever those things might be, beyond just what's happening on the courtroom end of things, really allows for that kind of free form of conversation when it comes to legal issues. So it's a really neat thing to kind of think of that being the inspiration for the listserv, where you just have this like great free exchange of ideas, but it's kind of built on this, interpersonal communication that occurs, that, I like these other people. I want to help them. I want to help young attorneys, as opposed to just being like, oh, I've got to get on this listserv and answer questions from, somebody that's up and coming, which again, there's nothing wrong with that, but there's more of a sense of like community and obligation when it's built out of that kind of personal relationship status.
I think you remember, one of what felt like one of the biggest wins in my first couple of years of practice was this speedy trial motion I had on a DWI.
Yeah.
It's back when the SBI lab was so backlogged. And my man was like, he always came to court with an oxygen tank. I never saw that. I don't know if he needed it or not. We're on a podcast, I guess, but he always had it. He was in his 70s.
He wore it in court.
It was one of those like, he brought it to court. His name was Bruce. Bruce, he picked up a DWI at 4 PM, and I could never figure out how to make use of this fact but it was kind of funny. He had a file stamped document from the courthouse that was dated and time stamped an hour, within the hour after he was cited for DWI. And I was just sort of like, this is kind of interesting that he came into our courthouse, managed to file a document, got a copy. Was he impaired? Was he not? I don't know, but nobody seemed to care, when they let him in the courthouse or serviced him at the counter. But anyway, so that was one of those where I was sitting in the coffee room and I just was lamenting. I was like, guys, this blood lab, this SBI lab is taking 2 years or more with the blood work.
Yeah. And
my guy's not going to plead without, I can't convince this guy to plead if I don't have evidence of impairment. They didn't really have it, stop. It was one of those kind of hit and run deals. Anyway. And Billy Anderson's like, well, have you thought about a speedy trial motion? And I was like, it was one of those oh, right. When things take a long time, we should be thinking about speedy trial issues. And it hadn't even occurred to me. It was all Bill Anderson. And he just mentioned it. And of course, all I need is someone to be like, have you thought about blank? And I went and went down the rabbit hole and read all the cases and did all the things. And so I threw that motion up there. I let the 2 years run. And Judge Keppel wrote this 6-page order that would I think everyone was kind of tired of it. The SBI lab had every opportunity in the span of 2 years. The DA's office had sent rush requests. And what does a rush request mean if
you're not doing anything?
2 years later, we're still waiting. And I'm not saying that's the reason they built a lab out here, but just, when you start putting pressure on the system in the right points and DAs and judges start putting pressure on the system, that's where we can make things. And I credit Bill Anderson with just a coffee room idea, which set into motion a series of events, and you go further down the chain and eventually we've got a lab here. And I don't think there's a single DWI on the planet now that's going to take that long to process blood work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That kind of requirement for those to be that backlogged, that you have to put pressure on the system to be incentivized to make it happen faster, right? Because if you don't do that, then the opposite effect is the person's just going to enter a guilty plea because they get tired of waiting, right? Because there's no dismissal getting offered from the state. So it's either, you plead guilty now or you wait until the blood results come back and then you plea or you take the case to trial. But, you can wear people down through that kind of time that just is constantly getting kicked to the next court date. I'm missing work again to come down to the courthouse and sit in the courtroom for a couple hours. And so, it takes kind of fighting back on that front to really, even if you lose, it's well, do we want to be spending our time having a hearing on the speedy trial issue? So there's really no way to lose that kind of a argument because everybody knows it's taken too long. The question is that enough to kind of get to a point of dismissal, which, in your case it was, but even if it's not, it's we should be fighting this either way.
Right. That's right. Yeah. That's, to the premise of the questions I think we talked about for the show today where, what can lawyers be doing? And I think that's it. It's, that's what I miss most during COVID right now, getting to talk with you about law and what our lives are like as defense attorneys, just workshopping cases and brainstorming I don't know if it's unique to Buncombe County, but I'm immensely proud to be a member of this bar, and specifically the criminal defense bar. I think some of those brilliant people that I've ever had the pleasure of working with are practicing right here, and they do it in a way that, there's a joy about the way they do it. They love what they do. They figure there's plenty of work to go around, and we're stronger together than we are in silos and isolated. So even though a lot of us are small firm practitioners or solo practitioners, you still feel like you're part of a team.
Right.
You've got people to turn to for advice. And I think, that kind of creates an obligation on me as someone who has been the recipient of that and the beneficiary of this wisdom that frankly has been passed through generations, right? Like the knowledge I'm getting, didn't just start with Andy Banzoff. Andy got it from Sean, and Sean got it from, it's like, it goes back hundreds of years probably. And so, I'm just the next generation who has an obligation now to pass it on. So we've brought Margaret Teichen to our office, and we got new public defenders coming on. And, I think as we gain this wisdom and knowledge, we have an obligation to pay it forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it's one of those amazing things of just shared brain power, because, you can sit in that room with somebody like Andy and just soak in this vast amount of information, right? Even if you don't have a case that you're specifically asking about, like just soaking in that information. And it's amazing how when there's a shared space for that to kind of be communicated within a group or within a formalized like bar association, how that really does kind of just empower the defense across the board, right? Because it's one thing to, as a prosecutor, realize that when Andy is going to try a case, he's going to have every issue covered, right? But then when that knowledge kind of trickles into other attorneys, and it's kind of like, okay, the defense bar is not going to, comply with this, taking so long for these lab results to come back, right? Like it's hard for one person to make an impact on that front. Once you have that kind of like group of, we gotta as a local bar really start pushing the state's buttons on this particular issue, or, try more cases, make them kind of have their officers in the courtroom, right? Make them give us discovery. When you have multiple people that are doing those things versus just one, it's just like the state kind of just says, well, it's just easier if we figure out a system for this, because it's no longer the Andy Banzoff problem. It's the, defense problem. It's just across the board.
That's exactly right. There's two things you said there that are just so important. We're in a criminal justice reform moment where nationally we're having these conversations around mass incarceration and the disparate impact on Black neighbors and friends in our community. These issues though come alive at the local level, even though these are political issues, national level issues, federal issues. The reality is that the day-to-day battle is right there down the street in your local courthouse.
It is,
and so that's where the battle is, even though the conversation happens at these high levels. And so it's incumbent on individual defendants, individual lawyers in individual cases to raise these issues. And you're going to have a much broader impact when you're putting pressure on the system. Because we all know you could have a great brief, a great motion in a single case, and you might move the needle just a little bit. Maybe you get lucky and win in your case. But if issues are being raised wholesale on the level, pushing your local DA's office, you're pushing your local bench, that's changing systems. And I think we saw that, for example, when COVID arrived and we wanted to reduce the jail population to try, the cost benefit calculus was changed when a global pandemic arrived, right? Like where before judges might have felt comfortable setting a $500 bond or $1,000 secure bond, to try to get the person to come back to court. Well, now you have to weigh in, does this person deserve to potentially die by contracting COVID as a result of a class 2 or class 3 misdemeanor, right? And I think our calculus changed right direction. I give major credit to our district court bench, the superior court bench to some extent, but really it's the district court judges that do that work, the district attorney's office, who are willing to have that conversation with us and have a dialogue with the defense bar. And we saw a dramatic decrease in our pretrial jail population like that in mid-March. When you look at March 13th to April 1st, it just dived. It was like immediately we're like, we got to get these people out. And I think that's an example of system.
Yes, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mike. I was just kind of, you probably see this a little bit more just because of your constant involvement with the defense bar, but it did seem like a joint effort between the state, the bench, the defense bar. So how does the kind of, the defense bar being somewhat organized contribute to that? Because it definitely felt more like a conversation as opposed to this, like, who's got the better argument deal. So you see more of that interaction with the state and the bench that the defense bar presence has. Yeah. Just talk about maybe the benefits of that, or what that looks like on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that's something that's probably going to vary county by county, right? Because it depends on the priorities of the attorney in whichever county, like what they're interested in, what their priorities are. But I will say, I am pleasantly surprised. I'm always amazed that there's more room for agreement than I think in the criminal justice system with local actors.
Yeah.
There are a lot of assistant district attorneys, probation officers, police officers who fundamentally agree, like, this is a problem. We need to figure this out. We need to solve this thing, whatever that thing is, whether it's cash, whether it's the pretrial population, whether it's, juveniles, the disproportionate impact of racism. There are a lot of things that we actually can agree on. And so what I find is that by us being the defense bar being organized, it has been welcomed by those actors, because before, and I'll say this too, when we got organized in 2013-14, part of the impetus for it, the reason, so we created this listserv, and then once we had a listserv, we're like, we should have a meeting.
Yeah.
we should get together. And we came to your office. You hosted the first ever Buncombe County Criminal Defense Bar meeting. And I think it was in March 2014. I just remember our son was born in that time frame. And I'll never, this is interesting because we decided to do this in response to the creation of Sobriety Court, which was then called DWI Treatment Court. And you can see from the bench's perspective and from the DA's office's perspective, they're thinking, yeah, we agree that treatment of addiction is a better approach to prevent recidivism than punishment. And so we'd love to try this out. And they're thinking all the things over here that we're thinking over here. Right. But there was no way for them to communicate with us and talk to us about it and get our feedback on it. Right.
That's interesting. Yeah. You can't, what are you going to do? Just call random individual attorneys and then leave a bunch of people out, right?
Think, guys, we're thinking about this thing, so what was interesting is I saw that and I thought, if we got organized, we could be like a cohesive body that can then participate in these processes and these discussions. So we had our first meeting. That was on a Tuesday. I get a call the day of the meeting from this guy I've never met named Todd Williams, who says, hey, I'm running for DA against Ron Moore. The meeting was on a Thursday. I got the call on a Tuesday. It was 2 days in advance. And we called the meeting, so it was planned. And I get the phone call from Todd. That's what it was. And he says, I'm running for DA. I'm driving down to Raleigh to file papers on Thursday. Just want to let you know. And I said, it's so funny you're calling me because we have a meeting. And I kind of have an agenda. It's mostly about this newfangled DWI treatment court thing. Do you want to come by and introduce yourself? Like, you've called me and it so happens we've got this meeting. And he's like, sure. So Todd comes by. As you know, he ended up becoming our elected DA. And to this day, I will probably never be able to convince Ron Moore or any of the people working on his campaign that we were not organized specifically to get Todd into office. It was the weirdest coincidence of a series of events. To this day, I'm adamant. I swear on my life, it was not planned. I found out after most people did, but Todd came by and introduced himself, and then we talked about the DWI treatment court. But as a result of us getting our act together, we now have a literal seat at the table on the Justice Resource Advisory Council, the treatment courts. We've been invited to conversations about pre-sentence reports. I mean, there are a number of meetings where I'll get a question from Judge Thornburg or Judge Hill or Leanne or Todd around COVID. Todd called me and said, hey, I'd love to work with the defense bar to come up with this thing. And I'll say this, some system like this doesn't work unless there are individual lawyers who are willing to show up.
Right.
And willing to do something. You were willing to host a meeting. Dustin has been willing to go to meetings. Thomas Ambergy, super active on the Justice Resource Advisory Council, goes to almost every single meeting.
Right.
Jason Wilson goes to the treatment. I get the credit for it, but the truth is, like, I organize the listserv, I get the emails, I try to communicate, but really it's many people making light work. It's many people stepping up. VJ Nathan, same thing. You know, if those guys don't get involved and step up, then this totally falls on its face moments after it launches.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, it's interesting to think about that timing with Todd, because obviously that's not what the purpose of the organization was for. But at the same time, I think that there was a lot of buy-in into his administration, like when he first started, due to the fact that he showed up at that meeting and talked to people, right? Like due to the fact that we want to have a conversation. And then, you know, Rodney Hasty did that as well, came to a meeting and, you know, was just there to kind of like, you know, explain a little bit about what some of the current issues were, but also to just like take a beating, you know, like verbal beating. But that opportunity to have a conversation between the prosecution and the defense that's outside of the courtroom, that's not about a specific case, I think is so valuable. So it's not even like the value that has been had with individual criminal defense attorneys showing up. But again, like that communication with the DA's office just creates a total different environment in terms of trying to see the other side of the table, right? Not just kind of how do we do better on our side of the table, but what does it look like from the other perspective?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I remember that meeting with Rodney. We talked about jail surveillance video, and I remember it was on my deck here at our house. I was trying to tell him, like, he came in the house and it was like really hot. It was like summer or something, and our deck I know gets really hot, and I knew he was gonna get grilled with a lot of questions. Yeah. And I was like, Rodney, can I get you like a Diet Coke or a bubbly water? He's like, no, I don't plan on staying long. I'm like, you think that's gonna be your out? And he stayed for, I don't know, an hour or two. Yeah. And then at one point he looked at me and goes, I'll take that bubbly water.
Yeah, no, but I think that took a ton of courage on his end to just kind of come in. Cause I don't know if he recognized exactly how much, what a direct point of kind of direct line of questioning he was going to get on some of the issues. I don't know kind of what his perspective of that meeting was going to look like, but he definitely was very, helpful in terms of just trying to like explain the state's position on certain issues and answering questions. And at the end of the day, there are points where, the prosecution and the defense are just going to have to agree to disagree. But knowing what is like the basis for some of those decisions, I think does help in terms of at least saying, okay, we can live with the, the position on this front because it actually does make sense for the community.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's so much of why I think this is invaluable, not just to defense lawyers, but to prosecutors and judges, is because then like information can just get communicated, you know, like now we have a Friday email that the DA's office sends out to lawyers about the next feast calendars. We didn't have that when we got the listserv organized, and we were
no
like,
trial calendar, no communication,
what time, or like there was no. And this is what I meant about like it's almost like you had to just intuit the information when you walked to the courthouse doors. It's like, okay, so the court's going to start at 11 on Monday, not 10. It's like there had to be a better way, and so I really appreciate that. When we created this listserv, that it was a welcomed thing. And so that's why I've encouraged lawyers also across the state, like, you've got your NCAJ, your NACDL, you've got all these statewide listservs, but the one that you're going to use the most is local. It's knowing what's happening on Monday morning. You have a different judge, or you move to a different courtroom, or, for COVID reasons, we need to create a different staggered schedule, and here's the sign-up sheet, so I would say, as silly as it sounds, the listserv is kind of the crux of the whole thing, and then it kind of grows out from there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, comparing it to the kind of like statewide level listserv that is the North Carolina Advocates for Justice Criminal Defense Bar listserv, DWI specific section listserv. Again, there's just so much value in having that shared information, even when you don't have a specific issue that you're trying to get addressed. When people ask me, new attorneys ask me, like, what can I do to advance my DWI knowledge, I'm just like, join the listserv and read every question and answer, and you'll be an expert in like 5 years. You know, you'll be able to see every issue come out. You know, like just read the questions and answers that come out on that. But if you want to be the local expert, that's what I think that listserv here in Buncombe County has done so well. Is, you know, there are, you know, just practical tips of where to go for certain pieces of information. Again, like this is not rocket science, but if you don't know who to go talk to about a speeding ticket 90 over, then you're lost, right? Like, I mean, you can't do a good job for your client. You can't figure out what you need to take so that the DA can make a decision about it. So it's all these little kind of like nitpicky things that are specific and constantly being updated as DA turnover happens in district court, right? Like, I mean, what is true today is a totally different system in a year. Who knows what this will look like after COVID? Like if we'll be doing virtual hearings regularly, like if, you know, plea by waiver is here to stay, you know, it's just such a constantly changing dynamic in the courthouse at the district court level. So there's just so much value to being able to share that with each other.
Oh, definitely. And I will say this too, it disrupts power a little bit, you know, which defense lawyers love.
Right.
You know, I'll never forget, I had one little, I mean, I don't know that I had many tiffs with Rodney, but there's one little tiff we had where he sent me this email basically saying, don't post this thing on the listserv. Like, dictating to me, like, you can't post this on the listserv. And you can imagine, you know, probably 2 words, but like I wrote a longer email and was like, you're not going to tell me, you know, like, no, I mean, that's not how this works. And by the way, I should say, Rodney was a member of our listserv, right? Yeah. He was a defense lawyer and then became the chief assistant, and may he rest in peace, and certainly prayers for his family. Yes. You know, great lawyer, brilliant man. But so we had this disagreement where he said, don't post on the list. And the point of it was like, he was afraid of what would happen this information. And I can't, you know, how these things go. I don't even remember what it was about. I have no memory whatsoever. All I remember is that WLS submitted a public records request and got a hold of it. And so it was, and I was sort of an inadvertent storyline because I was like, I was just trying to tell him to, you know, about this issue. You know, lesson learned, don't put that in an email, I guess. But, you know, just shows the power of the listserv, that the DA's office is mindful of it. They're aware of its presence. Right. They're concerned about it. And so, you know, it's also a powerful tool. And so I think anything that holds the DA's office to account, and is something that they have an eye on, like, what if this gets out there? I mean, it's a very powerful tool. I think it needs to be used wisely, which is why, you know, over the years we've had some funny little incidents around, like, making sure we protect the integrity of the listserv and what gets posted on it. But I think because all of us have a vested interest in it being a powerful tool, people have used it exactly what it's intended for.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that, in terms of our conversation, is to me really helpful for people that are outside of Buncombe County is just, again, how easy it is to kind of set up this shared information source, right? Like, I mean, basically it starts from people just kind of getting together in a, you know, small space and talking with one another, which I think most counties, you know, have that kind of a, you know, whether it's in the courtroom or a kind of lounge area near the courtroom, have that space where there is kind of this community feel. But I think that the listserv and the regular meetings are a very easy but very powerful next step to just kind of being like, you know, there is a shared, you know, desire for us as a team, like you said, to be able to kind of influence the way that, you know, kind of decisions are getting made at the county level where the defense bar may otherwise have no collective voice. And that's what I think is such a powerful thing, you know, in terms of setting policies and procedures, whether it's the DA's office or the judges or the clerks or whoever it may be. You have to have like a collective seat at that table or you don't have a seat at the table. And so again, just the ease of creating like this Google group. And obviously you need somebody that like takes the incentive and kind of looks at this and says, hey, we should really kind of formalize what it is that we are doing. But I think that is a really powerful but easy kind of next step. maybe kind of just want to get your thoughts on this before we close, Meghann. What in terms of the role of the public defender's office for places where there is a public defender's office, how do you see that role? Is it something, I don't know how many people in the public defender's office at the time were kind of involved in getting this off the ground, if it kind of started more as a private defense bar entity, and then how can the public defenders and the private bar kind of share information better, or use this as kind of like a joint opportunity to have a voice?
That's a great question, because the truth of the matter is the listserv was kind of formed precisely because the private defense bar we didn't know, we didn't have a way to communicate with each other. Like Leanne would let anyone know who wanted to know what's going on, but there wasn't like a tool for her to even send out calendars or, articles and whatever. And she would communicate with any private defense lawyer who came to talk to her, but there just wasn't that like channel of communication.
Right.
And so I just created this to create a channel of communication, but then it became evident like quickly to Leanne, who jumped on it and saw, yes, like that is the way I can now, all this information she's willing to share and is trying to share can now go out to the pool of private defense lawyers, which there's no question. I mean, this is kind of the example. We're all on the same team. Like whether your client is poor and appointed counsel, or whether your client is wealthy and can afford to hire an attorney, they're navigating the same system and the same policies and the same DA and the same judges. And so in that sense, we're still all on the same team, even if the way it manifests might look different in different cases. And so Leanne seized that. And I think I credit her as much as anyone with making it a valuable resource, because she immediately used that tool to then include us in, for example, the Justice Resource Advisory Council. We have a seat on that council because the public defender said, hey, the Buncombe County Private Defense Bar is organized and they can send a representative and they should be part of this conversation because of these reasons. And because of that, we have a seat at the table. That's because of the chief public defender. Right. So, I really applaud her for seeing the possibilities and making it broader and more, we've been able to achieve more than I ever thought was possible just by organizing a listserv, because she took advantage of that tool and gave us a seat at the literal table. And frankly, I think it's of a benefit to the chief public defender to not be the only voice in the room screaming about the Constitution and due process and defendants' rights and, those sorts of issues. So I think it's a mutual benefit. Obviously Leanne has moved on to the next chapter of her life, and Sam Snead has taken over as the chief public defender. And that is a daunting task, to take anything over in COVID. Anyone and everyone who's taking on a leadership role during a global pandemic has stones and courage, and I applaud them.
Which is probably why nobody's going to take your spot from you anytime soon.
That didn't help me make my pitch for a contender here. I'm really inviting opposition, as you can tell. So I think Sam, he's been diving into this role since, I guess, September. And I look forward to when we're all back to being in person. It'd be really nice. He joined in on some of our virtual meetings and he and his office have made invaluable contributions to us as private defense lawyers, because they're the ones whose cases are being tried first, right? When Tim Henderson's cases were first, second, and third for trial, he was able to report back about what he was seeing, but then that also gave him feedback. He had a way to hear from us, like, have you thought about these jury questions? Have you seen this article? Like, here's this declaration from this epidemiologist. Like, you can workshop your cases in the way the coffee room used to provide that platform. So I absolutely think if there's anyone listening to the podcast who's in another county who wants to do this, go talk to the chief public defender, go talk to the assistant public defenders. They'll be the first people to help you make this a tool that then everybody else is going to want to use and be part of.
Yeah, I agree. And I think even in terms of just having, kind of a collective push, of a collective force against, whatever the state might be trying to do or judges are trying to do in a specific place in a district that does have a public defender's office, I think it's almost an impossibility not to work with the public defenders, because there's just so many cases that are being handled by the public defender's office. And so if you can kind of, have a unified strategy about certain, concerns that you have, certain legal issues that you're trying to push, cases where you're getting, an outcome. I think, there's a county here locally where, and I don't know what their position actually is on it at the current time, but for a long time, county wouldn't do anything when it came to the district attorney's office wouldn't do anything when it came to improper passing cases for truckers, lane violations for truck drivers. And, I think that's one of those issues where if you had like a collective buy-in from enough attorneys to just say, let's just make everything for trial on these kind of issues, right? Like, let's just try, 80 cases, at some point, even if the DA wanted to push it, I think you get a lot of judges that are just like, we don't want to be spending our time doing this. Something's got to give here. Like, this can't go. And again, I'm not saying that's the only way to do it. Maybe you go and take that issue directly to the DA's office first as a group. But I do think that, again, like having that collective buy-in, and certainly if you're in a place where, a lot of these cases might be handled by the public defender's office, you have to have that like joint buy-in on that front.
And let's, I guess I would leave this with this thought, which is that, part of what this allows us to do is what we should be doing as defense lawyers, which is make the system do what it's designed to do.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. I mean, make those cases, take them to trial, file motions, make judges rule on, make the system do what it's designed to do. It doesn't work if we don't. We have to be the ones pushing it.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great place to end, Meghann, because that is the true value of having a collective force, a collective energy of attorneys, is to kind of be the defenders, right? Like, that's if we're not doing it, nobody else is going to step in and make that happen. So
just like my job as sucker in chief, no one else is signing up for it.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Meghann, for joining the podcast today. I really think that there's so much value in what you have done for the local bar and the leadership that you've shown for the local bar, and it's something that I think really ought to be replicated in other places, and then here locally, and as well as where this is already a thing in other parts of the state. Should be kind of this constant sharpening of the collective knowledge for all of us that are practicing criminal defense.
Well, thank you, Jake. Thanks for the kind words. It means a lot to me coming from you, and certainly nice to spend some time with you. Thank you for having me.
Definitely. Thanks, Meghann. Hope you enjoyed today's episode of the podcast. If you did, please share the podcast with another freedom fighter in the criminal defense community, and be sure to leave us a rating on iTunes. See you next time.